yourself a favor and don't write on your whiteboard with permanent marker, because it doesn't come off. And if you do that, don't use gasoline to remove it, because that can't be safe. Ladies and gents, welcome back to another video with the Volvo Sleeper. Today we are going to get this thing running. That's right, after all of the hard work, this LS, with this turbo, with this ECU, with everything in this car is going to run today. Now I cleared off the whiteboard because we have a long list of things we need to accomplish before this thing can run. A lot of the stuff on here is small, but there are some pretty major things. For instance, we have to finish up the power steering system and we have to get an alternator on here. We got to reinstall the turbo kit, do the turbo feed and drain line, do the drive-by-wire system, which requires the throttle pedal and throttle body. Then we put a tune in it. We gotta put fluids in it because I'm afraid I'm gonna forget that. And then wire up the fuel pump. And in order to get it to drive, we have to do way more than this. So without any further ado, let's get started. I think I'm gonna start with the power steering system and the alternator. That's not, no, that's, yep, and there it goes. Another one ruined. I got the other fitting to work. I need to give my sponsor, Finish Line Factory, a huge shout out because he helped me through this. The issue was that I was flaring the end of the steel too much, and thus some of that steel was getting into the threads of the aluminum and screwing it all up. Now it's good. I just have to overnight more fittings. It's surprisingly expensive to ruin a bunch of fittings and get them overnighted repeatedly. But I'm gonna go get more overnighted and then we can finish this later in the video. Now to get an LS1 alternator to fit on an LS6. I went ahead and removed the alternator bracket for the LS6 alternator, and the holes that mounted the bracket lined up perfectly with the alternator. So the alternator is good, all good. Now the problem is that if we just ran it as is, the belt would only contact the alternator pulley for, you know, 1/4 of an inch, and that would just slip at high RPM. So we have to take the idler pulley off of the old bracket and mount it in here somewhere. So we'll have to figure something out, but much easier than I was expecting, so that's good. And at this point, I was so focused on building the idler pulley bracket that I forgot to film. But here are all the components that make up the bracket. Now, let's melt them together. So the idler pulley is in there. Now I only tacked it to its bracket because I want to make sure it's straight, which actually it looks pretty decent, but we'll make sure it's totally straight, or straight as we can get it by eye with the rest of the pulleys. Then we will weld it in, and then we'll weld another bracket to some other hole so it can't move. So I came in this morning and finished up the alternator swap. The idler pulley mount we had made was basically finished. All I did was brace it a little extra, throw some paint on it, put it back in, and then get a pretty significantly shorter belt for the whole system. And now we have an LS6 with an LS1 1-pin alternator. Now I am a little worried about belt alignment because if that idler pulley is even a little bit off, it's gonna sling the belt off. I tried my absolute hardest while building the mount to make sure that the pulley was perfectly parallel with all the other pulleys, but there's really no way to know for sure until it started. Either way, we can cross the first thing off our list. Actually, two things: belts and alternator. Now, as you guys are watching this, I just posted the video where we did the fuel system, and you guys let me know something important. This car had 2 fuel pumps. It had the inline fuel pump, which I knew about, but it also had a lift pump in the tank. So that being said, we have to wire in 2 fuel pumps. Before getting the car tuned, we'll probably also upgrade the lift pump to some sort of DishWorks upgraded fuel pump. I think it's time to reinstall the turbo. I screwed up big time. See, I had purchased a small little fitting, a dash 4 male to dash 4 male, to tie together 2 oil feed lines to make an oil feed line for this turbo. Because I could not find a single oil feed line long enough to just go straight to the turbo. Anyway, I bought that fitting a while ago. I remember taking it out of its package, testing it, and like, oh yeah, it works. I can't find it now. I've looked for an hour. Like, I don't know where it is. I need that to start the engine because the turbo needs oil. I'll hop on eBay, order another one, hopefully be able to ship it fast and continue work on something else. Which, by the way, the longest oil drain line I've ever made. You know, I'm trying to start the car tomorrow afternoon, and this list is looking very incomplete. So that's the start of our downpipe, and this is the O2 sensor for the ECU. LSs have a lot of nice nooks and crannies to hide wires in. It's awesome. So I'm cleaning out the trunk to get to the second fuel pump, or I guess the first fuel pump. This could have been helpful. I wouldn't have had to wait until all of you guys commented and corrected me. I could have actually figured it out myself. Look at this. It's got everything. Sure enough, there she is. Fuel pump number 1. And I can replace the crusty fuel lines too. I came in this morning, I went ahead and got the drive-by-wire throttle pedal mounted. So now that that's mounted in, we can go ahead and run the wiring for the drive-by-wire system, put the throttle body on. Now here's the thing. The new throttle body I got has a different bolt pattern. I have that throttle body, but I don't have the adapter yet. So we're gonna plug the throttle body in, have it sitting there, but it won't be attached to the engine. We'll at least be able to get everything calibrated and get the tune loaded in with the throttle body plugged in. And then once we get the adapter, we can actually bolt it to the engine. This is, thankfully, as simple as just plugging everything in. Although it actually looks like there is one wire that's not plugged in, so I'll have to do something with this. It's seeming like the cooling system's not going to happen today because I can't get my hands on the proper aluminum, but that's fine because we can still fire the engine for a few seconds without coolant in it. John is on his way here with a new turbo feed line since I lost that fitting. So I think while we wait for him to get here, we're gonna go ahead, turn everything on and start getting the tune sorted. I wanna get a tune in the ECU so I can wire up the fuel pumps because that is actually through the ECU. It's got a wire for that. And then I need to get a wire to the starter, fill it with fluids, and then we're good to go. So key on. All right, so now we can actually do the setup procedure, hopefully. Initial power up, turning the ignition key to the run position. Do not attempt to start the vehicle until you are told to do so and the instructions below. A lot of stuff I have to set up here, and I lost the little stylus, so that's unfortunate. Select system type, GMLS, yes. That's the gas, I'm pushing the gas right now.
Really?
Yeah, it's all electric, isn't it pretty cool?
That is, man, yeah.
Now the initial tune is loaded. The only issue is that they didn't have the D-Schwerk injectors as an option in the little tablet. I can still program the D-Schwerk injectors to work with a computer, but I don't have a computer here. So we're gonna hope that the, I did the right CCs, so we're gonna hope that it will at least work enough to idle. But it might not, in which case we'll have to come back with a computer. Drive-by-wire worked, which was pretty cool. Now, gonna go ahead, wire up the fuel pump. And John just got here.
I got hose.
John!
I got hella hose.
All right, we got the turbo feed done. Cooling system now. We got the tune in there. Got most of the fluids in there. John's wiring the fuel pumps, and that's it.
Fuel pumps are wired in. Careful, if there's a fuel leak, these Cheetos might start a fire. Those are flaming hot.
Goodness gracious. The Holley signals a relay to turn on and listen. Does it for 5 seconds. And that is both of the fuel pumps wired up. So it sounds like the one fuel pump is struggling a little bit less. It sounds much better than it did, so that's good. We're gonna adjust fuel pressure, put trans fluid in, and then we can try to fire it.
Where is it?
It's like one of the only two that's not crossed off, John. We unplug the injectors and the ignition system. We're gonna crank it until it builds oil pressure. Then we're gonna plug everything back in and hopefully fire it up.
Good, you got it. You got it. That took a while.
Yeah. I was like a little worried there for a second. And then I saw it went from 0 to like 1. I was like, okay. All right. And then it was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, let's tighten that.
Anything with
Hey, the
throttle?
belt didn't fall off. I just realized that.
Did
The
it
belt didn't
walk?
fall
Did it
off.
walk at all?
No, not at all.
Nice.
The belt's like perfect.
That's sick.
Oh, how's the power steering fluid? No, still. I guess nothing. And this is when the nightmare started. What I'm assuming is for some reason it's not sensing that the engine is turning over and thus not turning on any ignition or anything like that.
That sounds like it makes sense to me too.
But why do? Well, we can't get it to start, and after looking at the diagnostics and such, it seems as if it's not getting a cam or crank sensor reading. It could be a wiring thing, it could be a battery voltage thing, it could be a sensor thing. So I'm starting off with just replacing the crank sensor because it's 1,000 times easier to replace, and that should at least tell us whether or not the sensors are the issue. We also had a power steering leak. You know those PTF fittings I had to buy like 3 times? One of them was leaking. Thankfully I bought one extra, so I put the new one on. But I don't know if I put it on good. Like PTF E-fittings suck. Nothing, unfortunately, and the sensor didn't even change any of the readings from the ECU on the crank, so I'm worried that the sensor isn't even the issue. After this, I went ahead and replaced the cam sensor, but that also did nothing. And at that point, I didn't know what to do. The instructions that came with the ECU pretty much just said, if you can't get an RPM signal, call Holley. So I waited 2 days until Monday and gave Holley a call. And they told me to replace the crank sensor with an OEM crank sensor. See, I had just bought a AutoZone crank sensor. So let's head over to a Chevy dealer and get an OEM crank sensor. And to my surprise, that also didn't do anything. The ECU still wasn't picking up any signal from the cam or the crank. So I went ahead and gave Holley another call. And they pretty much wanted me to return the ECU so they could check to see whether the ECU was good or bad. But I was pretty confident that the ECU was good. Everything else on the engine was functioning as it should. Now, something you guys should know about this Holley Terminator ECU is that there are 7 diagnostic LEDs on the front of the ECU. These are LEDs that tell you pretty much what in the system is working and what in the system is not working. There are 2 LEDs for the crank sensor and the cam sensor. When everything is functioning correctly, the LED for the crank sensor should flash green repeatedly, and the LED for the cam sensor should oscillate between blue and green. Both of those LEDs for me were stuck blue. Nothing was happening with them. So over the course of the next 2 days, I did everything I could possibly think of. I retuned the ECU numerous times, tried turning off the cam sensor in the tune. I upgraded the firmware on the tablet for the ECU and the ECU itself. I tried numerous TPS auto sets. I redid the entire harness install, which meant I redid all the grounds, all the powers. I added ground cables. I checked the actual reluctor wheel with a camera. All of this returned nothing. The ECU, the engine, was still acting the exact same way. It was cranking just fine, everything was working, but it couldn't pick up a RPM signal. At that point, I was totally out of ideas. So I went over to Mike's new shop, PFM, and he told me to check the harness, which was probably something I should have done earlier. Now, while checking the harness, I noticed that the pin for the cam signal input and the crank signal input seemed to be swapped. Now, it turned out that I was actually using the wrong wiring diagram, so those pins were totally fine, but I went ahead and swapped them because I thought they were wrong. Of course, the engine still didn't start, but I did notice that the diagnostic LEDs on the ECU started to work. The cam was flashing green, and the crank was turning on and off and on and off. So, I knew I was on to something. Something had changed. I went ahead and swapped those 2 pins back, and oh my God, guys. I can't tell you how freaking confused I am right now, but it runs. So I guess it was a pin in the ECU side of the harness that wasn't seated all the way. So when I took them out to swap them, and then took them out again to put them back, that seated all the way, made contact, and the ECU picked up the signal. So it ran. Now I know it didn't run very long, but we don't have that cooling system in, and the power steering system's leaking. So there's still some more work to do, but it did run. It sounded amazing for the few seconds it ran. Guys, I'm sorry this took so long. I'm sorry that it was such a mess, and it was all just a pin in the connector. Oh! I spent almost $300 worth of new sensors, countless nights of insanity and depression, and all it was a freaking pin. But yeah, sorry it took so long. We figured it out though. In the next video, we'll get the cooling system in, hopefully get the drive shaft brakes in, and take it for its first drive. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Peace out, and goodbye.